Okay, I think we should start the ball rolling.
Great, yes, it's gone 10 o'clock, gone half 10, yeah.
So just a quick introduction. We're delighted to welcome Grace McCormack, Professor of Zoology in UCG, and she's joining us for a webinar for National Tree Week. And of course, we have Éanna, our President of the Tree Council. And so Éanna and Grace will discuss Grace's research on the native honeybee and its status in Ireland. So take it away, Éanna.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Good to see you, Grace. Nice to be talking to you this morning, and thank you for agreeing to talk to me about the Irish black bee, because I'm really curious about this. Are honeybees not all the same? You know, in the sense that bumblebees are bumblebees and they're our native species as such from a point of view of being bumblebees. But are the honeybees not all the same? Is there a specific Irish one?
So, yeah, I mean, I'd probably say that no, they're not all the same, but also bumblebees aren't all the same. There's many different, probably more species of bumblebees in Ireland. We only have one species of honeybee in Ireland, but we've lots of species of bumblebee in Ireland. And even within honeybees, although it's one species of Western honeybee, and then so Apis mellifera, and then there's the Eastern honeybee as well, Apis cerana, which from Asia. But even though we have a Western honeybee, Apis mellifera, within that honeybee has distributed right across Europe, and has, because the climate and the environment is different all over Europe, it has evolved into very different types of bees. So we call them subspecies, or some people like the use of the term ecotypes, where the honeybee, you know, if you think about the honeybee has a really tight association with its environment. It uses the environment, the plants, and in its area really carefully. So it needs them for food and habitat and everything. So as the environments change, the honeybees adapt to those different environments. So it has evolved. At the moment, there could be as many as up to 33 different types of that species across Europe. And in Ireland, we have a subspecies that's called the black bee, or the northern bee, or the brown bee, which is called Apis mellifera. So it's the subtype of bee that has probably the biggest distribution range across Europe. So in Ireland and England, we have a very different climate as well to many other parts of Europe. So that subspecies of honeybee has also adapted to the unique climate in Ireland. And it's thought that there are quite significant, very local adaptations in Ireland that are unique, probably similar, Ireland and England having very similar environments that make it different to even other members of that subspecies across Europe.
Now, did we always have honeybees in Ireland? Are they a native species? I mean, did they come here by themselves after the Ice Age? Or, as some people might think, were they brought here by monks from Europe because they were a source of sweetness in a world 2,000 years ago where there was no sugar cane, no sugar beet, no sweetness, only honey. Sweetness was a greatly desired thing. Or was it just that the monks were the first to domesticate them? Or is there no link at all between monks and bees? Am I making all this up from some ridiculous memory I have? Because you do see skeps and things on old monasteries, and we know certainly that the monks used bees. But can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, so I guess there's differences of opinions about this, but it's generally accepted now that yes, there's an association with monks, and yes, monks brought bees into Ireland and other people did, but it is now generally accepted that bees were here before that. We don't know if bees were here before the Ice Age, because everything died here at the Ice Age, and it's thought that honeybees retreated into what they call refugia, these places of refuge in southern parts of Europe because of the Ice Age. And then after the Ice Age, as trees started to expand, when the ice melted and trees and other plants started to extend their distribution across Europe and up into Britain and Ireland, that bees and other insects would have followed the trees. So it's thought that trees and bees crossed the land bridge from Europe into Britain, and then across this land bridge into Ireland. Now, there's some disagreement as to whether there was an actual land bridge between Britain and Ireland, and different modelling of the times or whatever give different stories. But it's thought that even if there was no actual land bridge, that the distance between Britain and Ireland was so short at that time that not only honeybees, but other insects, other invertebrates, both flying and non-flying, came naturally into Ireland. And there's no reason to doubt that the honeybee didn't do that as well, because in the old reports of so we know people started bringing in bees from Britain across in boats from the 6th century, so 500, the time of St. Patrick. Those people that landed reported seeing bees. They were very sparse, but they were present when they arrived. And then there's I'm kind of looking into this more and more, but there's some archaeological evidence of the use of bees in like Dunangus in the Aran Islands, the use of wax for making things. I can't remember what the name of the things are called, but that there's evidence of wax usage back in archaeological time. So we don't have archaeological specimens of honeybees back from thousands of years ago, but there's archaeological evidence of the use of bees. And so we have this kind of subsequent introductions of honeybees into Ireland, both by themselves and then by people from ancient times. And of course, as you said, like one definition of native is if the organism can come on its own, under its own steam. And there's no reason to think that honeybees didn't make it to Ireland after the last ice age by itself. But another way of looking at native is whether an organism or an entity has weaved its way into folklore, mythology, language, and culture. And it's clear that honeybees have are really part and parcel of our culture. So from the Book of Kells, I think the honeybees in Ireland predate the written word, because when the written word started to be formed, there was already use of bees in the Book of Kells. Wax was necessary for the writing of the Book of Kells, and in our language, in our Irish language, the bee laws, the Brehon laws, use of bees was already well embedded in the culture, so that by the time when they're writing these laws, that the bees were so important at that time that they made significant laws in terms of managing those. So I think bees have been here and have been important to Irish culture for a long, long, long time.
Indeed,
Yeah.
speaking of Brehon laws, trees were very important too. So actually what you're saying then is that woodland, because that was the climax vegetation in Ireland, woodland is the natural habitat of bees, of honeybees. Before we ever talk about beekeepers and beehives and things like that, that bees originally would come and the woodland would be their natural habitat. Now, can you expand on that? Where would they live? What would they eat? How would they work in a woodland?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess Ireland, might never have been hugely densely, well, I guess at one point it was densely wooded, wasn't it? And when trees become damaged, so you can, when trees become damaged and cavities get created within the tree, so sometimes lightning damage or a major branch breaks off the tree and causes kind of the start of a cavity that in England, woodpeckers, can cause cavities.
We had woodpeckers in Ireland too.
And they're starting to spread again. So yeah, absolutely. I'm starting to hear that. And then so some signs of kind of bees living in trees would be some of these fungal shells that you'd see sometimes on the outside of trees that normally indicate some decay within the tree. And in many cases that would indicate a cavity, and you might often see honeybees living in trees where you see these fungal shells or you see damage. So the first case is the creation of this cavity that bees and the cavities, the tree provides insulation. The bees will adapt the cavity, they'll coat it in propolis and stuff to protect themselves. And then trees are an important source of nutrients as well. If you have hives under trees in woodland, sometimes it's not great because the dampness created by the forest, it drops down on the hives, and damp is the greatest kind of killer of bees, really. They don't do well with damp. But if a bee is living in a forest within a tree, the tree is providing a beautifully insulated, dry environment. So you can have, bees living in trees. So we do look for wild colonies within trees. Now, with the kind of the lack of, with us cutting down our trees and we have little forestry left, we need to protect it, especially the native So they like oak trees, ash trees, beech trees would be kind of three of the more common. But they'll occupy anything that has a cavity, and they have obviously adapted to the lack of trees in Ireland by occupying roof spaces and wall cavities, and anywhere where there's a dry cavity they might occupy. But trees would have been the first.
Would have been the first home for them, and then
yeah, and actually they can feed on like the pollen and so on, but they also apparently will feed on like fungus growing on trees can provide an important source of protein for bees. If there's no pollen and stuff in the air available at the time, they'll actually use fungus and stuff like that growing on trees.
Very enterprising indeed. Then humans came along with their buildings and their skeps and domesticated the bee essentially. So we ordinary folks tend to think of honeybees as belonging to people, belonging to beekeepers. And I'm looking at your lovely hives behind. Yeah. So you don't own the bees, but you manage the bees, and the bees come and go, and that's great. And presumably Irish beekeepers have black bees, and these are the bees that they have, the native Irish one, which does well. Or is that true? Or is the black bee under threat now? Or what do generally beekeepers have in their hive? Or what's the story on that?
There's an awful lot there now, so you interrupt me and change the topic if I talk too long, because I
will, yeah, but I don't want to be
jump in there.
So firstly, we've gone from the wild bees in the woods to the people owning them now. Yeah. What do the people own? Yeah.
So I tend to bristle when I hear that bees are domesticated. That's the first thing, because the poor honeybee falls between two very large stools when it comes to our care of them. So I would say bees are not domesticated, but they have this dual recognition by, say, the Department of Agriculture, is that they're domesticated and wild. So they were first a wild species that we manage. So yeah, you were right when you say we manage them. So we've put them in boxes. And actually the development of beekeeping has got also pros and cons. So in one sense, beekeepers are custodians of our honeybees, and you know, they also kind of advocate for bees and for the environment, and so some of their beekeeping associations are primary speakers out against the destruction of hedgerows and things like that. But at the same time, the development of the hive with movable frames started the real negative impact on this honeybee, the native honeybee in Ireland. So we have Apis mellifera, and Langstroth developed the kind of movable frames, I suppose it was the end of the 19th, early beginning of 20th century, when they became kind of adopted by beekeepers. And at that time, the other subspecies of bee, like the Italian bee and the Slovenian bee, were thought to behave a little bit better on the frames than our black bee, like, you know, a bit of trouble, like a bit of aggro. So some places in Europe moved over to actually preferring these other types of bees. So Germany completely replaced their black bee, which would have been similar to the black bee in Ireland, with Carnolian bees, Carnica bees, and they've lost their black bee. And what happened then when they started bringing in imported bees, Carnolian bees and Italian bees are very different lineage to our bees in Ireland and Northern Europe. And they've been separated for a long time, since the Ice Age, since the melting of the Ice Age. They stayed kind of to the east and south of the Alps, and the northern bee evolved very differently, really quite very, very distinctly different bees. And when you cross things that are very different like that, it can create what we call outbreeding depression, which is, and the second generation of these crosses are very aggressive. So here you have a black bee, looks black because when you cross them, the Carnolian bee is kind of brown as well. And so when you cross these, you get these black bees that end up being very cross and aggressive. So the Germans decided, to hell with this aggressiveness, we're going to get rid of our black bees, because they started kind of blaming the black bee for this aggressiveness. And this kind of perpetuated these kind of observations, but are kind of maybe not fully informed observations, have actually caused a huge problem for our black bee. And so we have a problem in that. The second problem was that in the kind of early 1900s, we had an outbreak of something, an epidemic in the Isle of Wight in the bees, and the bees just died off in huge amounts. And the black bee seemed to be very susceptible to this. Now, it was called the Isle of Wight disease, and still don't really know for 100% sure actually what that was. Some people blamed the acarine mite for it, and that the black bee was very susceptible to this mite. And at that time, there was a big population crash in black bees, and Brother Adam in Buckfast Abbey in England, who's a really experienced beekeeper, he became aware of this massive population drop. But he said that the bees went extinct. The bees in Ireland and England went extinct at that time, the black bee, and he endeavoured to breed a new strain of bee, which he called Buckfast, by taking strong colonies of different subspecies and breeding them with whatever was in England at the time. And this created this artificial strain of bee, which is very good from a beekeeper perspective. So we had this kind of, at the time, it's subsequently been found out that really bees didn't go extinct at that time. So Brother Adam was wrong in some of the elements of what he said, but it created this market for these commercial bees. And so they became very popular. And actually Britain have essentially lost their native bee. There are pockets of the native bee here and there, or the native bee kind of contributes to what they have, but because they thought they lost it completely, they have imported so many bees that it doesn't really exist in a pure form anymore in the UK, except in
Ireland, then so it started in the Isle of Wight. Brother Adam in Buckfast invented a new bee, and presumably the beekeepers bought this and brought it home to
yes. And because Brother Adam was a monk as well, of course, the religious connotation.
Yes. And he was making Buckfast tonic wine, which I'm sure was rather nice.
Yeah.
But moving on then to Ireland, did the Irish beekeepers also buy this Buckfast bee? And what's the story here now today? How did it get from Britain to Ireland then at that stage?
So in Ireland, I guess things were slightly less reported in detail in Ireland. So definitely Brother Adam came over and found black bees in Ireland. There were black bees in various places in Ireland, and he tried bringing them back and breeding them and stuff. So definitely the black bee was impacted here. There was a big population crash at that time as well. And then people started bringing in the Buckfast and Ligustica and Carnica. But I think what happened in Ireland, which is different from England, is that we don't have so many commercial beekeepers in Ireland. And we have a lot of kind of remote areas, and we have a different way, we have a different culture. And people like their local stuff. So beekeepers in Ireland seem to have continued to breed their local bee. Also at the time, the then Department of Agriculture brought in bees from the Netherlands, which were also black bees. Rather than bringing in Ligustica and Carnica, although they did come in, the department brought in a lot more of what we already had. And so they have been continued here. So in Ireland now, we have a mixture of we can detect that big import of Dutch bees, but we also have a lot of very diverse black local bees around the place. And we did a survey a couple of years ago, and the IBA, the Irish Beekeepers Association, also did a survey, and both surveys agreed that over 90%, around 90% of beekeepers surveyed had native bees, and the reasons they kept native bees was because it was the best bee for their local environment. It was the bee that was here already, and they wanted to conserve that. So we have a different approach, I think, in Ireland to beekeeping than there is in many parts of Europe. And I think this has been brilliant for our native bee, because we have actually helped conserve this. And this bee is endangered across all of its range in Europe. There's tiny pockets of almost pure Apis mellifera across Europe, except in Ireland we have a very significant population of this. So,
so that was all grand. So we the Irish beekeepers had enough
the bees here,
bees until the 1990s, when this desperate varroa thing arrived. Now, this was a different scale altogether, because the varroa is a mite that is a tiny little insect that goes onto the legs or the bodies of the bees and sucks out their juices, and it's a parasite on them. And this was brought in completely illegally by New Age travellers in a high-haste van or something to County Roscommon. in the 1990s. That the received wisdom that I have. But so what would I know? So see, is that so? Or tell us about Varroa.
Yeah, there's a few different stories. I heard that came in Sligo and spread very quickly across. Yeah, so that was the second major devastation to Irish bees. And at the time, actually, the department had a ban on imports to protect us against Varroa, but it came in anyway. And there was a massive loss. And so bees, when they get infested with Varroa, really many times in the second year they succumb. Basically, if they're not treated with chemicals, they succumb. And so beekeepers we lost an awful lot. Again, a huge proportion of our population was lost. A huge proportion of the wild living honeybees were lost. Those that were susceptible to the mite were lost. But in any kind of a diverse population, you would hope, no more than myxomatosis introduced to Australia, wiped out most of the rabbits, but there were rabbits who were resistant to that.
Yeah.
So wiped out a huge proportion of our population. So beekeepers now treat. A large proportion of beekeepers treat. In our survey, about 30% of beekeepers said that they don't treat, and that number has increased in recent years. So beekeepers are now using natural selection themselves and trying to breed bees that they don't need to treat. But still, the vast majority of beekeepers have to treat their bees with chemicals to protect against Varroa. Otherwise, in year 2 or 3, the bees will succumb, because the Varroa, it's like having a parasite. It's like having a tick the size of a fist on your shoulder, or in between your between your shoulder blades, trying to suck your liver dry, basically. So they feed on we thought for a long time they feed on the hemolymph, but now they feed on the fat bodies, which is the bee's liver, basically, and the bee's method of building fat to survive the winter. And Varroa does that, so it debilitates the bees, but it also, actually, probably the most dangerous thing is it transfers a cocktail of viruses. And so we had some viruses here, like deformed wing virus was probably endemic, but in a very non-impactful virus present in our bees. But when it circulates through Varroa, we start getting this highly virulent form of the virus that chews up the wings of the bee, so they can no longer fly, and has a lot of other consequences.
But how would it get into the wild? I mean, aren't bees faithful to their queen, and the worker bees go home to the queen? So how did it get into a new nest? I mean, did the bee sort of go on a visit somewhere else? I mean, how did it get from an infected place to a non-infected place?
Yeah, it's a good
that
question. The Varroa has kind of 2 parts to its life cycle. So firstly, so there's the Varroa bit. Part of it lives inside the brood, the nest of the bee, but then the second part of it, when it comes out of that, it climbs onto individual bees, and the bees fly, the Varroa goes with them. So there's a number of ways that it can affect them. So sometimes, while you say bees are kind of loyal to their hive, they are to a certain extent, but if there's a weak hive in an area, bees from other colonies will rob it of its honey. So if they can get in, they will. Also, if you have high density of colonies all beside each other and all looking the same, the bees can get confused. So beekeepers will often paint their hives strong colors, and yellow and black and white and blue and so on, so that help the bees distinguish their own colony, and that prevents disease transmission. Drones, the male bees, will often colony hop, so they fly long distances to mate with a queen. But they will often go into strange colonies to get a bit of grub along the route. So they can also...
You can blame the men.
You can blame the men, but the women also do. The women will go in and rob other colonies. And also there's some, I have seen some where it's possible, but probably highly unlikely, that the Varroa can be transmitted even on plants. Can hop from one
bee with Varroa was getting out something from the plant, leaving a few Varroa behind, and the next bee picks them up.
Something like that, yeah. I'm not sure how common that is, but it's a potential route, yeah.
So from all of that, then, you're saying that there are, because we have native wild bees, some of the bees are resistant to Varroa, and this is becoming apparent now. So Varroa is not a problem as much as it was in wild bee colonies. So there still are wild bee colonies. They haven't all been made extinct by Varroa, as we were led to believe.
Yeah, so I mean, we can't hand on heart swear that there were always wild colonies there. It's likely they were. It might be that over time, and what also happens is bees swarm. So bees will swarm out of boxes as well as they'll swarm out of trees. So it is 100% likely, or the situation that bees will swarm from apiaries, and they will go into other cavities. They don't always go into a box. So, but over time, they are not treated by beekeepers, and that might be over, since the 90s or all the time. And so the other thing is that wild bee colonies are much further apart, so that they're not as highly dense as in apiaries, boxes and apiaries. And so horizontal transmission of viruses and disease, or varroa and diseases, is much lower in the wild colonies than it is in apiaries or between apiaries, because of the difference in densities. So it was thought that the Irish bee, the M lineage of bees, didn't have, like the Eastern honeybee has evolved with varroa and has evolved behaviors that both varroa and the bee together is this arms race, isn't it? They both have evolved a coexistence where they can tolerate each other. And the idea was the Apis mellifera didn't have that coevolution. So that's in progress. So I'm not saying that bees are resistant to varroa here, because they're not. They're highly susceptible, and it would be a real mistake for beekeepers to think they are. But some of them probably have, and it's increasing in the population. The more honeybees that exist that aren't being treated with chemicals, the more natural selection, the more we're selecting for strong colonies. The more we continue to treat bees with chemicals, we're actually breeding weaker strains of bees. So I would love to advocate beekeepers to try a mixture. I mean, I'd never tell beekeepers to stop treating altogether, because beekeepers love their bees and they could be devastated by losses but what I do in my apiary, I don't treat, and I try and keep, maintain the colonies that are surviving. But if I thought that a colony, was, there's an animal welfare concern, you don't want to leave a colony that's riddled with disease when you can treat it. So there's this balance. I would, if you catch a swarm that might potentially come from a wild colony, why treat that automatically? Why not see how it does by itself first, and only treat it if it needs to be treated? And if we can kind of have this thinking about colonies and whether they need treatment or not, we can, over time. It'll only really work if we try and bring this in the whole population. Because if we're breeding weaker bees at the same time, we're
it's counterproductive, actually.
Yeah. So but it's a work in progress. So it looks, yeah.
Yeah, it looks, so looking overall at the bee situation in Ireland now, the black bee situation, black bees under threat in Ireland. Is there a problem? I mean, you've discussed the varroa and what's happening with that, but is there any other threats to it? Are there threats from foreign bees, or are we allowed to import bees now? Or what is the story on the situation at the minute?
Yeah, so this is a hot topic at the moment, very hot topic. So according to trade laws, and Ireland is a member of Europe, according to European trade laws, honeybees can be traded. And so transhumance is an issue. We move bees across borders and across countries. We sell queens and import queens. And I think up until reasonably recently, there weren't huge numbers of imports into Ireland, and we could pick up the main problem with imports of foreign bees into Ireland. I said that the bees in Italy and Croatia and that are very different from our bees, and they're not adapted to our climate. So bringing them in, people do bring them in because they have traits that beekeepers like. They build up really rapidly in spring. That's the main one, and they can produce a high honey yield in a good year. But there are negative aspects of those subspecies as well in Ireland. So they don't tend to, they don't tend to survive our winters very well. And in a dry year or in a very wet year, they don't do very well in breeding or in being able to forage, because our bees are they manage their brood and they manage their food very, very carefully. So, but what happens is when you bring in these bees, they fly, and their males will mate with the local queens and create these hybrids. And the hybrids can be maladapted, so they're neither fish nor fowl, right? But they also can be very aggressive. So I think when imports were very low, And because of the sheer numbers of beekeepers in Ireland keeping black bees, the population was doing okay. The numbers of hybrids and imports versus our number of black bees allowed us to maintain this population of black bees. However, even then, there were pockets of places in Ireland like Sligo and Leitrim, Dublin, Cork, Kerry, Limerick, Clare, where the imports were severely impacting the local beekeepers trying to keep black bees. So you know, spend an awful lot of time trying to mind and breed your black bees, and then a neighbor, due to either ignorance or because they like buckfast, bring in something else, and then all of a sudden you now have an apiary full of hybrids instead of your black bee. And this is a problem. And of course it happens the other side as well. You know, you bring in non-native bees and they get back crossed with local drones. But what's happened in recent years, the numbers of imports of bees was between 75 and 100 back in 2012, around that time, 12, 14. And that's gone up to over 1,200 queens per year in recent years, every year. So that order of magnitude difference in numbers of imports, I'm now seeing that when I'm in the genetics of the samples we're collecting. So the numbers of hybrids was between 2 and 5% when we did the study back that we published in 2018. And now when I look at them, the numbers of hybrids are going up to between 13 and 25%. In fact, in Donegal, the numbers of was about 30%. Recently in Connemara, 20%, and they've really these conservation areas for the black bee, and it just takes one person bringing in a non-native bee to destroy all of that. And there's commercial beekeepers in Connemara who rely on selling honey of black bees abroad, and this impacts their business. And in Dublin, there's a crowd called Open Hive that collects swarms around the place, and then they hive them up and they manage them and sell the honey. And their data suggests that 75% of the swarms were non-native, were hybrids. So this is now starting to have a huge impact on not only, I suppose, our population, but because our population is so important for this subspecies in Europe, it is putting it all at risk. Are we going to become like the UK, where we have a whole country of mongrel bees rather than, and what happens, the unique traits that have evolved to allow our bee to mate and survive our bad summers, what happens to those traits when we have a country full of hybrids that don't have those traits anymore? What's going to happen to beekeepers who can't afford to buy in new queens every year and to make money? What happens to the hobbyist who wants to protect our local biodiversity and wants to have local bees, but can't because the bees won't survive the winter, or they can't get mated on a bad July because we've lost that trait that Irish bees have? So in Ireland, the queens normally will travel a long distance to mate, to protect against inbreeding. So they go far from their colony to mate with non-local or non-related drones. But in Ireland in winter, in July when it's raining, our queens can't do that sometimes. So what they do is they mate locally with related drones, and they suffer a small period of inbreeding, enough to sustain the colony, and then they'll replace the queen, the next generation queen that might be slightly inbred. They'll replace her when the weather gets better, and that queen can go out and mate with non-native drones. So we have this lovely, beautiful adaptation to our environment. And what happens when that trait becomes bred out because of hybridization?
So can import of bees then be stopped, or is this a right because all EU have free trade between one another? Or is there any status for, the way they have Appalachian control or regions of, you have for other products like the Waterford glass or a special regional speciality or things? Is there no protection for the native Irish bee under that sort of thing? Or is it a free market all round?
It's a free market at the moment. The Native Irish Honeybee Society teamed up with the Climate Bar Association. So these are a bunch of barristers on the East Coast that do pro bono environmental work. And they have been looking at this and put forward legal arguments that we should. The EU have come out with statements that that they encourage member states to protect their biodiversity. And there's the precautionary principle that you shouldn't wait till the threat is there that you're going to lose it. You should protect it. If there's a threat ahead, you should start protecting it now. So together with, and I was involved in that, the Climate Bar, they wrote this, and with Senator Vincent Martin, I should mention him because he's a Green Party senator and TD, and he became a beekeeper, and he became aware of the situation here. And so he involved the Climate Bar. So anyway, wonderful piece of work, resulted in legislation that was put to the Senate in October 2021, the Protection of Native Irish Honeybee Bill, which is looking to seek banning imports of not all honeybees, but just the non-native subspecies. So people can import bees, the same subspecies that we have in Ireland. And we're not asking to exterminate anything that's non-native that currently exists in Ireland. You know, it's here, but to stop bringing it in, because bringing in imports brings in disease, but it also then continual imports continues to prevent local bees from continuing to adapt. It keeps, you know, bringing in new things all the time just prevents anything from settling, basically. So that bill is past the third stage of the Senate, and there's a bit of a hiatus. The Department of Agriculture went to the Attorney General to get advice on this, because the trade laws, you know, the government has to be very careful that they don't bring in a legislation that can be very easily contested. They have to do due diligence, right? So they've paused it a little bit while they seek. They've just brought out a tender, which I've brought together an international team, will apply for it anyway, to provide independent scientific evidence about, you know, are there these differences between the different subspecies? Is there something worth protecting? Why should we protect it? What is the impact of this imports and hybridization? And we're going to look at that and really provide this additional scientific evidence that this protection bill is necessary. The thing is like NIBS, there's a lot of voluntary conservation areas across the country now. A lot of people are signing up to the Native Irish Honeybee Society and signing up to these. But the problem is with the best will in the world, if you've got a whole team of people locally who voluntarily conserve an area for the black bee, it just takes one person to decide, I don't want to do that, and bring in something different, and you can't protect it. And this is what's actually happening. The Galtee area in Tipperary is well known for being the heart of the black bee, and they've been advocating for its conservation for decades and decades, and now that's under threat, you know, because people are bringing in non-native bees. The Connemara crew have been trying as well to protect bees there, and now there is increased integration there. So voluntary conservation areas are brilliant, but they on their own are not going to fix the problem.
And what about Brexit? I mean, what about the Donegal and the Cavan and the Monaghan beekeepers? I mean, is there any legislation in Northern Ireland, as opposed to, I don't want to get into a political discussion.
Yeah,
with,
no, actually it's gone down.
But
yeah.
I mean, the people in Northern Ireland know very well there's an all-Ireland approach, and they had all-Ireland approach to things like buttonnuts, for example. So, I mean, they are not beyond having agreement for Northern Ireland as an island separate from Britain. So what take have they got on the bees?
I have to say,
they can fly over the border, no bother at all.
I think Brexit was a huge scare, because there was so commercial beekeepers in the UK who import large amounts of bees into the UK couldn't do it because of Brexit laws, because now England wasn't part of Europe. And some people definitely did bring imported bees into Ireland in a lorry, drove them up to the border, let them fly, and then brought them into the UK, and then could bring them to England. But due to huge pressure, there's a guy, McGregor in Scotland, who had intended to do this, and he actually succumbed. You know, he listened to the overwhelming response to this, and he didn't do it. And, you know, kudos to him for not doing it. You know, that's brilliant, because it would have impacted his business. It was the first time that all the associations in England and Ireland actually came together and agreed. So the Federation of Irish Beekeepers Associations, the Irish Beekeepers Associations supported the Native Irish Honeybee Society, the UBKA, so the Ulster Beekeepers, and there's another one, I forget the acronym. There's another beekeeping, and I'm sorry for this.
Welsh
in
people,
Northern Ireland as well, the independent beekeeper, I
Yeah.
can't remember what it's called, and the BIVA, so the British beekeeping, the Scottish beekeeping associations, they all supported and wrote letters of support to the government in Ireland, and we're all unanimous that imports are a bad idea, not only for hybridization but for disease. It brings in disease, and it should be limited. There'll always be, black market stuff, back door.
But so they're all singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah,
Anyway,
brilliant. Yeah.
good luck with that. Hopefully you get the tender. But now it's National Tree Week, and I have to ask you about bees and trees. Now, we did start off at one point earlier on in our conversation saying that woodland had been the original natural habitat for bees. So what do bees get from trees? I thought they used to go to trees and gather up propolis to line up their hives. So it's probably more than that. But start off maybe with the propolis. They do collect propolis.
Yeah.
What is propolis, and where do they get it in the tree?
Propolis is from the sap of a tree. And popular, that tree is probably one of the main sources of propolis for bees, apparently.
The poplar.
The popular, yeah. And so they bring it back and they use it to plug holes. We see lots of nice photographs of wild bees in cavities in trees, and you can see really clearly that they've darkened. The entrance is really dark, and you can see outside it's all dark, and that's all propolis. So it has antimicrobial and antiviral properties, and this has been shown scientifically as well. So it gives, it's part of their social immunity, but it also plugs gaps and holes. So if you leave, it's sometimes beekeepers select against bees that collect propolis. I actually select for bees that protect propolis because I collect it for myself and I make a tincture, and I haven't had a sore throat since I've been doing that. So it's really good for people as well. So yeah, they do that, and so that they'll coat the inside of the hives if the inside of the hives is rough enough. If you put in a mesh, they'll fill the mesh with this propolis. And yeah, it can be a bit of a nuisance to be able to lift the frames because they stick everything down with this propolis. But it has it's important for bee health.
It keeps the bees healthy by having propolis.
Yeah.
It's their health. And then
so trees are a really important source of pollen and nectar for bees as well. And
we did spell it out for people, because I don't know how many schools I go to. What do bees make honey from? They make it from pollen, and there's all a big mix between the two. So there are two separate, completely different things that bees collect for completely different jobs. So let's start with the pollen. Do bees actually collect pollen, or is it just a nuisance on their face and they pollinate plants when they're looking for nectar by accident? Or do they actually go off looking for pollen in the first place?
They absolutely do.
They do, because they have pollen baskets on their legs. And what do they want? And what do they want it for? Speak about the pollen.
Or a little bit you said it right. If you look at a bee leg, their anatomy has been designed to actually collect pollen in these pollen baskets, and they use it for protein. So the protein, the pollen is used to make bee bread, and it's fed to larvae. So that's a really important, and so really for the brood can't develop without that protein of the pollen. And of course the pollen actually also contributes. So when a larvae is born, it has it's sterile, its gut is sterile, and so they get the gut microbes from the pollen as well. So they get inoculated with, we know how important our gut microflora is for our own health, right? And more what we call this holobiont, it's really important for our own health, and actually mental and physical health in people. And it's the same with the bee, and they actually get inoculated, that they get some of their microbiome from this bee bread.
So it's only baby bees then that eat the pollen as such, that the pollen is needed for. It's not needed for adult bees as such. They don't actually eat it.
I think they do. Oh God, no!
You've got an exam.
You're all moment of indecision. Generally for pollen, yes, they do. It's most, I suppose, really important for larvae. And then the nectar is used.
So hold on to the nectar for a minute. I'm just thinking then of trees that are particularly useful with pollen, and these are the trees in early spring that have catkins. So I'm thinking, I know you were speaking of poplar, which does have catkins, but also things like hazel, things like willow in particular, they have just catkins that are wind pollinated. Exactly. So the trees get their seeds because of the wind. The bees are just swiping some of this
Yeah.
pollen for themselves. Do they actually collect that kind of pollen?
Yes, they do. Yeah, it's really important early spring. So when there's not that many flowers around, they're using the trees, and the hawthorn is a really important source as well.
Yeah, well, we're back to flowers now. Once we get to the hawthorn, we have a flower with petals and perfume.
Oh
and all
yeah,
of
well,
that.
okay, I'm not
So
a botanist. I'm not a tree, but I know very little about trees. Yeah, yes.
there's
So
two
they're
sorts of trees. Trees with
collecting-
no
yes,
wind pollination,
yes,
but
yes,
they're made for bees for the pollen, and then
yeah,
trees with flowers on them, like
yeah,
hawthorn, like mountain ash, and they have petals and they have nectar,
yeah,
bride, and the
and
pollination.
pollen. Yeah.
And so why do bees want nectar then, and how do they get that?
So I guess the nectar is the carbohydrate intake for the bees. So they will go and yeah. So I guess they have particular shaped mouth parts, so they will collect nectar from where they can. And they bring it back and they will dehydrate it. And there's people here on the call now that know more about this than I do, as a newbie beekeeper. But anyway, yeah, so they'll dehydrate it. So I think nectar would be around 80% water, and they will dehydrate that so that it's under 20% water, and they store
That's
it as honey.
As honey, indeed.
Yeah.
So there's the two different things, and the bees
Yeah.
don't collect them both at the same time.
No.
You're either on pollen collecting duty or you're on
Yes.
nectar collecting duty.
Yeah.
You won't then you die of exhaustion after 6 weeks of all of this.
Yeah.
But you don't do both at the same time. They haven't evolved to do that yet.
Well, they do, like there's different families of bees in a hive, and they take cues from the hive as to what's needed. So the nectar collectors, might be more predominant at certain times, and then they'll switch over to collecting, or different bees will go collect pollen. So there's still a lot of work being done on the signals and the cues about that, and how and what's the balance in that. But they take signals from the hive and what's needed in the hive. And of course the plant chemicals present in the pollen and in the nectar are really important as well. No more than for why we eat honey, it's really important for the bees, as part of their social immunity.
So this is all fascinating. So learning about this would obviously do us all a bit of good. So even though I have a garden the size of a postage stamp, I mean, is there any way where people who want to keep bees, or people just want to know more about bees, is there any way you can go to learn about this, being taught by professionals like yourself? Just look up books and hope for the best.
That's a lovely segue into our diploma, isn't it? It's very nice. Actually, there's loads of sources online. First, I mean, in terms of the most important thing people can do is plant things, is create habitat for not only honeybees, but the rest of the pollinators. So our honeybees are doing better than some of our solitary bees and some of our bumblebee species. So it would be a mistake to get a hive to save the bees. That has been done. And in some cases, that creates pressure on honeybees, on wild and nearby beekeepers because there's only a finite amount of forage in an area. So for a lot of people who, wants to do stuff for pollinators is planting bee-friendly trees and flowers. And there's the All Ireland Pollinator Plan have got and there's lots of other websites that give you specifics on what trees and what plants to plant to do that. We have a diploma.
If we only have a postage stamp of a garden, we can all plant.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
And actually planting stuff, the flower at different times a year, not to think about everything at the same time. So early spring and autumn and winter is really good for it will be good.
Is it true, now I have the horse's mouth here, is it true that bees can't see red flowers?
Yeah.
Don't plant red flowers.
So that's an interesting area as well. Bee vision is very different. Yeah. So they have red color blindness. Yeah.
So that's the first bit. So go out and plant, that's always good. Now, if you want to actually learn stuff, you have a diploma you're going to tell us.
Yeah, so it's funny, there wasn't any really formal courses or anything available in Ireland or UK. They have a national diploma in the UK, but not run by a university. So yeah, we're providing a level 7 diploma, encouraged by the Federation of Irish Beekeepers Association. So it's in collaboration with them that the last CEO really drove me to establish this, and so they've been helping out, and some of those senior beekeepers are teaching on this diploma and really contributing where I can't, because I'm I'm only beekeeping since the last 10 years. So yeah, and it's on bees and beekeeping. So it's a little broader than just beekeeping, and it's designed really for anybody who wants to know more about biodiversity, specifically really social insects. But everybody on it at the moment are beekeepers, but it's not designed only for them. It's designed
an adult course, an evening course, a part-time course.
Yes, all you need is to be over 25 to do this course. So it's a level 7, so it brings people through that. So there's no requirement for a recent leaving cert or
and is it 1 year, 2 years, 1 night a week, 2 nights a week?
It's a 2-year part-time diploma. It's 1 night a week and then some Saturdays, sometimes 2 nights a week when we've got multiple modules. So there's 3 modules per year over 2 years. And it's online mostly. So online lectures, live lectures for the most part. And then some Saturdays for each module on campus in the labs. So doing stuff in the lab and stuff. Yeah, it's great actually.
All information can
covering
be
things like general entomology, social behavior of social insects, so like also ants and bumblebees and things like that, pollination and pollination behavior and beekeeping practice, and then all genetics and evolution and honeybee health, all these topics.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure there's some connection. How do you find out more about it? Have you a website, or how do we go from here to applying to do this course?
Actually, the websites, I can't remember. It's if you Google diploma in apiculture, NUI Galway or University of Galway now as we are, it'll come up on Google straight away. Yeah. So we have a website which is galwayhoneybeeresearchcentre.com, and there's a link to that. There's details of the diploma on that as well. So that's probably the easiest, galwayhoneybeeresearchcentre.com. And actually, if people are interested or see wild bees, people are interested in trees here, and are looking at trees or whatever and see wild colonies. We have a reporting tool in the National Biodiversity Data Centre where people can report wild colonies, and then we'll follow up with them. And then we have a monitoring system where we're monitoring the survival and fitness of these wild colonies.
So you want to know what bees are in the wild colonies. You're not going to take away the wild colonies, so people can say.
Oh no, we'll be monitoring them over time, and we'll sample them and test them genetically and see how they're doing. Yeah, and actually learn from them. That's the whole point, is to learn from them.
Know where they are. Listen, it was a pleasure talking to you this morning. And maybe if you're not rushing away, we might see if there's any questions from
Sure.
Siobhan. Siobhan, can you appear again? There you are.
Yes, indeed.
Was that great? Have you any questions, Siobhan? Has anybody asked anything?
Well, I think it was so very well covered that there are very few questions, except for one did pop in, and it was, is it true that there is a health benefit to eating honey from your local area?
Yes. So local honey will have, as we said, the local honey will have some trace of pollen from the local plants. And so if people are allergic, have hay fever, for example, it's often used as my father used to have local honey to treat his hay fever. And I've given our frames of honey to local people because these kind of small amounts of local pollen present in the honey can help, desensitize people. And can help treat hay fever, can help lessen the impact of hay fever. That's apparently.
So it's not an old wives' tale. Honey is good for you in general.
Anyway,
local honey has this extra belief because it has the pollen from the local flowers. Some of it is still in the honey itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And just one last question then was, is there an expiry date on honey? Does it ever go out of date?
We have to put an expiry date on honey legally, but actually honey's got such little water content that bacteria and stuff can't really live in honey and it's been used. I've heard some wonderful talks from doctors who apply, and I use it for treating animals and stuff. And actually myself, I got a really bad burn on my face at Christmas. I splashed oil on my face and I used honey on it, and thankfully got rid of the scarring and everything. But for treating wounds as well, and if I burn my hand, I'll immediately put raw honey on a burn. It stops the stinging and it stops it getting infected. So, and that's because the lack of water content. So, sorry, what was the question? I went.
It won't go bad. It doesn't go bad.
So it doesn't really go bad. but we have to put an expiry date on it. I mean, what can happen is, if, say, for example, the jar has been open and water, so because it has such little water, it'll attract water, so the water content will increase, so it can ferment. So sometimes you'll see honey where there's a
split.
It has split, and sometimes the top of that will have higher water content, and so that can ferment. So that might happen, and then you can make mead out of it.
And of course, the other thing that happens to honey, we see, because we have flowing honey, and it can go hard and crystallize, become solid like soap. But that doesn't mean it's gone bad. That's just a function of temperature, because if you warm it up, it'll go back to being liquid again.
Yeah, it's just the formation of crystals. Yeah, it's just sugar crystals.
Yeah. You can keep your honey forever, but you shouldn't be keeping it forever. You should be gobbling it up and
But the only thing is, if it ferments, it might ferment if it has a little higher water quantity due to you opening it and maybe putting a spoon in, adding water or whatever. Or if the honey you bought happened to not be at the right sugar water ratio, then it can ferment. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, Siobhan, I think we've had our hour. We've had a wonderful conversation with Grace. And Grace, thank you so much for sharing all your information.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I didn't know everything about the trees. I just
we're going to make the connection with trees, because we tend to think of flowers in the garden, or flowers with petals on them as being the only thing for bees. So it's great to see that there's a connection with trees, both for habitat and for those catkins that have no petals on them and yet are full of pollen for the bees. So it was a good liaison between the two of us as well.
No, trees are so important, for habitat.
Long live the black bee. We want to keep it going, the Irish one.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys, for the opportunity to talk.
And thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you.
Cheers.